Carolina, Puerto Rico, January 12, 1981. It's close to midnight, and a group of 12 people have just landed on the shore of a lagoon. They are all carrying satchels. Inside each satchel are homemade bombs, created with 4 sticks of Iramite attached to a timer set for 60 minutes. These individuals are members of the Puerto Rican pro-independence Boricua Popular Army, commonly referred to as the Macheteros. In their sights, the Muñiz Air National Guard base, which they have just landed outside of. These 12 people are about to carry out the most devastating attack on the United States Air Force by a non-state actor in history. The destruction they are about to bring had not been seen since the Vietnam War. But how did we get here? To answer that question, we will have to look at Puerto Rico's history. Puerto Rico became a U.S. possession in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. The United States' victory over Spain was the end of the Spanish Empire in North America, which had ruled Puerto Rico since the 1500s. Ironically, only a few months prior, the Spanish government had granted Puerto Rico autonomy, a major step towards independence in a struggle that began in 1868 with an armed uprising known as Grito de Lares. Now, with the United States in control, Puerto Rico's dreams of independence had been shattered once again. Initially, the island was placed under military rule, which lasted until 1900 when a civilian government was established. While the legislature was directly elected, the President of the United States appointed the governor and had a say in the governor's cabinet. Puerto Ricans, however, were not considered citizens of the United States. They could not vote in national elections and had no say in the island's administration. Despite obtaining a limited civilian government, Puerto Rico's economy was struggling. The first governor of the island, Charles Herbert Allen, had mishandled its financial administration and effectively used his position as governor to take personal control of the Puerto Rican economy. Additionally, the U.S. administration largely pursued a policy of Americanization, including mandating the education system to be taught in English rather than Spanish. The U.S. military also established a significant presence on the island. All of this contributed to a rise in pro-independence sentiment. Initially, the independence movement was represented by a political party called the Union of Puerto Rico, but eventually other organizations would emerge. In 1914, the Union-led legislature unanimously voted for independence, but this was ignored by the United States. Instead, Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship in 1917 under the Jones-Shafroth Act. However, they still did not have a say in the federal government, and the island's governor remained appointed by the president. Disagreement over the Jones-Shafroth Act within the Union of Puerto Rico would lead to independence being dropped from their platform, causing many to leave the party and form their own organizations. In 1922, an amalgamation of these splinter factions united to establish the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, which would be the first organization to advocate for violent struggle. The Nationalist Party initially tried to engage in constitutional politics, but it performed poorly in elections and often clashed violently with the Puerto Rico police. The US-appointed government saw the party as a threat and frequently used the police to target their activists. This included an extensive surveillance program targeting any and all supporters of independence. As a result of this repression, the party began to advocate for violent revolution in the 1930s and formed a paramilitary wing known as the Cadets of the Republic. A police massacre that killed 4 nationalists at the University of Puerto Rico in 1935 saw the initiation of attacks, with 2 cadets assassinating the chief of police the following year. Violence between the police and the Nationalist Party would continue throughout the 1930s and 40s. This included the 1937 Ponce Massacre, where police killed 17 nationalists during a march commemorating the end of slavery. The party would also be involved in organizing protests and strikes across the island. The unrest caused by nationalist agitation resulted in the Puerto Rican government, which was still under the direct influence of Washington, passing Law 53, better known as the Gag Law, in 1948. This made it illegal to display the Puerto Rican flag, sing patriotic songs, and to call or organize for independence. In 1950, U.S. President Harry Truman signed a law that would turn Puerto Rico into a commonwealth, allowing the island to establish its own constitution. The Nationalist Party saw this as a step towards total integration into the United States and launched an armed uprising in October, which included an assassination attempt on Truman.
Here in Washington, two of them attempted to assassinate President Truman in Blair House, where he is staying during repairs to the White House. Approaching from opposite directions, they opened fire on the police guards.
A combined force of the Puerto Rican National Guard, FBI, CIA, and Puerto Rico police violently suppressed the uprising, and thousands of Nationalist Party supporters would be arrested in its aftermath. On March 1, 1954, 4 members of the Nationalist Party in Washington, D.C. opened fire on the U.S. House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen. This would prove to be the final attack in the Nationalist Party's fight for independence. The party would decline in the aftermath due to the imprisonment of most of its important leaders. Although diminished, pro-independence sentiment still existed and was revitalized in 1959 with the formation of the Pro-Independence Movement, abbreviated MPI. The Cuban Revolution, which had also succeeded that year, greatly influenced the MPI, which would eventually adopt Marxism as part of its platform. Alongside the MPI, a number of other pro-independence organizations and important figures would emerge, many of whom advocated for armed revolution. One of these figures was Filiberto Ojeda Rios. Born in 1933 in Naguabo to a nationalist family, Filiberto Ojeda Rios was a witness to the 1950 uprising at the age of 17. As he got older, he became a musician and played trumpet for a number of bands during the 1950s and early 1960s. At some point during this time, he was introduced to Marxist politics and joined a political group called the Liberation Movement. There, he was introduced to the Cuban Revolution and traveled to Cuba with his family in 1961, where he received paramilitary training from the Cuban government. Ojeda Rios would take inspiration from the Cuban Revolution and aimed to replicate it in Puerto Rico. After an alleged meeting with Fidel Castro himself in 1966, he began to organize his own paramilitary group. Alongside members of an MPI splinter organization known as the Socialist Workers' Party, he would establish the Revolutionary Independence Movement in Arms, or MIRA for short. MIRA, like other contemporary nationalist paramilitaries, would advocate for a clandestine strategy as opposed to the direct combat attempted by the Nationalist Party. MIRA began its attacks in 1969, which primarily took the form of bombings against corporate and government targets. By 1970, most of MIRA's members in Puerto Rico were arrested, including Ojeda Rios, although he would jump bail and disappear underground. However, MIRA would continue to be operational until 1973, primarily through a cell it had established in New York City. Ojeda Rios spent his time on the run reorganizing the armed movement, first helping to establish the infamous Armed Forces of Puerto Rican National Liberation in 1974 from the remnants of MIRA's New York cell. He then returned to the island and organized the most important of all Puerto Rican nationalist paramilitary groups, the Macheteros, alongside Juan Segarra and Orlando Gonzalez Claudio, among others. The Boricua Popular Army Macheteros and its political wing, the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers' Party, would be established on July 26, 1976. It brought together members of the MPI, which at this point had transformed into the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, its student wing, the Pro-Independence University Federation, and other smaller nationalist organizations, all of whom were united in their belief that armed struggle was the only way to free Puerto Rico from U.S. rule. They began operations in 1977 following the ascendancy of pro-statehood Governor Carlos Romero Barcelo to office, although the group would not publicly reveal itself until August 24, 1978. That evening, the Macheteros shot dead a police officer and tied up another in a botched attempt to steal uniforms and a police vehicle. A communique sent to the media claimed responsibility for the incident and announced the existence of the organization. From that point on, the Macheteros began claiming responsibility for a series of increasingly sophisticated and deadly operations. Soon, they would turn their guns on the U.S. military presence on the island, an issue that the pro-independence movement had consistently protested. On December 3, 1979, the Macheteros, in conjunction with two other nationalist paramilitary groups, ambushed a U.S. Navy bus in Sabana Seca, killing 2 sailors and injuring 10. The ambush demonstrated the capabilities of the paramilitary groups, whose activities were clearly well planned and more advanced than anything seen within the borders of the United States up until this point. However, this was only the beginning. While the audacious attacks against the military and the government certainly gained them local attention, it was not enough to raise significant awareness of their cause internationally. In addition, the US military presence on the island remained, and it appeared it was not going anywhere. Despite all the nationalist activities, the US wasn't budging, and the pro-statehood local government continued attacks on supporters of independence. Hadn't numerous protests, bombings, and now attacks on military personnel sent a message? The Macheteros were then determined to carry out an operation that would simultaneously attract international attention for Puerto Rico's independence struggle, while also dealing a significant blow to the hated US military presence. In the latter half of 1980, they began planning an operation which would become known as Pateira II. The name of the operation is a reference to a local bird on the island, the pateira. It was given the number 2 in reference to an earlier operation dubbed Pateira on March 12, 1980, when a car carrying Army ROTC officers was struck by gunfire, wounding 1. However, the sequel would not be another machine gunning of military personnel, rather the Macheteros would target the military's pockets. In the early hours of January 12, 1981, the Macheteros would put their plan into action. That evening, boats set off from an unknown location, crossing the waters of the Laguna La Torrecilla to the east of the Muñiz Air National Guard base in Carolina, Puerto Rico. They landed about a half-mile from the base on a stretch of lakefront beach overgrown with mangroves. The leaders of the operation were Macheteros founding members Filiberto Ojeda Rios, Juan Segarra Palmer, and Orlando Gonzalez Claudio. Also joining them in leadership was Isaac Camacho Negron, the group's treasurer. A total of 11 Macheteros would participate in the actual assault, while Ojeda Rios would stay behind to cover the escape. The militants made their way through the thick foliage that marked the path between the shore and the base. After a half-mile journey, they reached the edge of the base, identified by a chain-link fence. It was after midnight, their arrival perfectly timed to occur during the shift change of the base's guard. They were wearing military uniforms as well to blend in. One of the Macheteros begins cutting a hole in the fence. Once it is big enough to crawl through, the 11 slip in. In front of their eyes is the staging area of the 156th Tactical Fighter Group of the Puerto Rican Air National Guard. There are 12 A-7D Corsair IIs and an F-104 Starfighter that is on display. They quickly got to work. 7 of the militants stood guard, while 4 moved up the flight line, placing bombs on the planes. 2 devices are left on each, one inside the air intake duct and another on the landing gear. A total of 23 bombs are placed on 11 of the A-7Ds and the F-104 display. For some reason, one of the A-7Ds was left alone. Just as quickly as they entered, the Macheteros left through the hole in the fence. The entire process had taken less than 8 minutes. The Macheteros reunite with Ojeda Rios at the beach and board their boats, sailing away into the night as the timers for the bombs tick. At around 1:45 a.m. came the first explosion, then the next. In total, 11 of the 12 planes targeted exploded. 8 of them were entirely destroyed. The damage would be estimated at $45 million. It would be the most expensive attack on the US Air Force by a militant group in history.
The Puerto Rican terrorist group calling itself Machete Wielders is claiming responsibility for the midnight bombings at the National Guard base in San Juan. The attack on a fleet of jet fighters virtually destroyed the Air National Guard in Puerto Rico. David Garcia reports.
The explosions at the base were heard for miles. Immediately, law enforcement rushed to the scene. There, they found the aftermath. Some described the scene as resembling a battlefield. Indeed, no such guerrilla attack had struck the military like this since the Vietnam War. Amidst the rubble, they found a machete painted with the Spanish acronym of the Macheteros, EPB. Meanwhile, someone was making calls. The San Juan offices of United Press International and the Associated Press received phone calls from someone claiming to speak on behalf of the Boricua Popular Army, stating that they were responsible for the attack. A day later, the group released a communique claiming responsibility and outlining their reasons for carrying it out.
Pitirretu responds to the need of our people to continue fighting the North American colonial yoke. We denounce the murderous, anti-Puerto Rican, and abusive regime of colonial governor Romero Barceló, which is becoming more repressive and dictatorial against broad sectors of our people.
The statement continued on, condemning Puerto Rico's government for its involvement in the deaths of 4 individuals. Juan Rafael Caballero was a Teamsters Union organizer who was kidnapped and strangled to death by elements of the Puerto Rico police in 1977. Adolfina Villanueva Osorio was a woman shot dead by the Puerto Rico police during an eviction in 1980. The 2 young independence fighters mentioned in the communique are Carlos Soto Uribe and Arnaldo Rosado Torres, members of a small militant group known as the Armed Revolutionary Movement. The group was infiltrated by a police agent who led Soto and Rosado to their deaths in a police ambush. The killing of Soto and Rosado became a major scandal for Carlos Romero Barceló's government, and it nearly brought his governorship to an end. His pro-statehood New Progressive Party lost its majority in Puerto Rico's Legislative Assembly during the 1980 elections, but he was re-elected as governor amidst allegations of electoral fraud. The Macheteros clearly believed his governorship was illegitimate. The bombings at Muñiz Air Base were not simply a demonstration of the tactical capabilities of the Macheteros, but a multi-layered political statement. Not only were they directly attacking the contentious U.S. military presence on the island, they were sending a message that attacks on independence supporters would not be tolerated. Also reinforcing its political weight was the fact that the attack took place on the birthday of legendary independence leader Eugenio María de Hostos. Their message was meant for a global audience. The Macheteros recorded a video of them preparing for the operation to send to the media. The video shows masked militants preparing the explosives that would destroy the fighter jets. It was mailed to several journalists who refused to hand it over to law enforcement. The spectacular nature of the attack led to the attention they craved. The story was picked up internationally and made headlines in Puerto Rico and the United States. It was condemned by the mainstream political parties in Puerto Rico, with Romero Barceló referring to the attack as an act of treason. However, the pro-independence movement was supportive. Juan Maribras, the leader of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, praised the attack and stated that the Macheteros had, quote, overcome the mediocrity and sloppiness that we have severely criticized in armed actions. For the Air Force and FBI, the immediate question was, what went wrong? Immediate scrutiny fell on the base's security. At the time of the attack, there were only 2 guards on site. One was stationed at the guard post at the base's entrance, and the other patrolled in a vehicle. Clearly, this was not enough to detect 11 nationalist militants. The fact that the Macheteros had entered the base during the guard shift change also concerned investigators. It suggested the possibility that someone on the inside had leaked information. An investigation was launched, but yielded no results. However, Juan Segarra Palmer, who planned the operation, claimed that a Machetero supporter who had joined the National Guard fed them the information.
Un compañero pues se apuntó en la Guardia Nacional y asignó al grupo de seguridad de la base. Eso es la información valiosísima, así que ellos tienen información de adentro y tienen información de afuera. En algún momento va a hacer falta.
The militants had also conducted extensive surveillance of the base in the months preceding the attack. On one occasion, the base held an open house which Segarra attended to gather intelligence.
Hubo un momento en que no faltaba tanto. Ellos hicieron un open house en la base, entonces lo abrieron al público y entonces pues pude ir, tomarle fotos a los aviones, ¿sabes? ¿De dónde le vamos a poner la goma? Clic.
The main concern for the Air Force became improving the base's security. An electric perimeter fence replaced the old chain link one. The number of guards at the base increased to nearly 60, with up to 10 on patrol at one time. The National Guard had actually been aware of security flaws at the base, but failed to act on that knowledge before the Macheteros struck. The bombing had been a wake-up call. The attack at Muñiz Air National Guard Base was one of the most spectacular operations carried out by Puerto Rican nationalist paramilitary groups, but it would not be the last. The media frenzy generated by the operation died down quickly, and the Macheteros, while proud of their work, conceded that their success had its limits. Attacks on the island and within the continental United States by groups advocating for Puerto Rican independence would continue well into the 1990s, and the Macheteros continued to be a thorn in the side of the military and the island's government. Muñiz Air Base itself would be attacked again on March 17, 1991, when unidentified assailants snuck onto the base and set an A-7D on fire. Macheteros' activities were largely curtailed as a result of the arrests of its important members, including Ojeda Rios, in 1985. This was the result of an investigation into the group's connection to a 1983 robbery of a Wells Fargo depot that netted the militants $7 million. In 1990, while on bail awaiting trial, Ojeda Rios cut his ankle monitor and returned underground. While he still advocated armed struggle, Macheteros' activities significantly declined and the group stopped claiming credit for attacks in 1998. In 2005, after 15 years on the run, Ojeda Rios was shot dead in a gun battle with the FBI at his home in Hormigueros. His death sparked widespread outrage in Puerto Rico, even among those who did not support independence, demonstrating the tacit support the Macheteros enjoyed during the peak years of their activity. Since Ojeda Rios' death, the Macheteros have effectively been on a ceasefire. The group still exists, under the command of a certain Comandante Guasabara, but it has not engaged in any attacks. 2026 will mark the 50th anniversary of the organization's founding. In the meantime, the political situation in Puerto Rico remains largely the same, although there is the noted absence of organized violence. Puerto Rico remains unable to vote in federal elections, and its reliance on the US has only increased in the wake of disasters like Hurricane Maria in 2017. Within the island's legal politics, it seems as if independence sentiment is growing. Typically, pro-independence parties in Puerto Rico have done poorly in elections, owing to several factors including past repression. However, in the elections for governor that occurred in 2024, the Puerto Rican Independence Party came in second place, the best electoral result seen by nationalists in decades. The United States military presence on the island also remains a tense issue. Protests against the use of the island of Vieques as a bombing range by the US Navy reached their height in the late 1990s. Ultimately, they were successful, and the Navy completely left the island in 2003. As recently as 2025, there were protests outside of Muñiz Air National Guard Base demanding an end to militarization in the context of the tensions between the United States and Venezuela. The days when nationalists picked up the gun are over, and groups like the Macheteros are all but forgotten in the popular consciousness, but there once was a time where attacks like the bombing of Muñiz Air Base were commonplace. The Macheteros may have failed to achieve independence through violence, but their story underscores greater questions about the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. 40 years later, the attack reminds us of Puerto Rico's continued unresolved status and how some attempted to resolve it with bombs.